beginning our treatment of Margaret Atwood's novel Oryx and Crake, the first two things I'd like to say about it is one, that this is a particular genre of novel called a dystopia. Sorry for the bad handwriting. And then also that it is the first of a series of, in a trilogy, a series of 3 novels that is called Mad Adam. Written by Margaret Atwood, that all deal with the destruction, the virtual destruction of the human race and the beginning of a new race that has been created by Crake. Just to go back to this idea of dystopia, though, for a minute, you've probably heard, if you haven't heard of a dystopia before, you may have heard of the term utopia, which literally means no place. Okay, so it's supposed to be a story about a wonderful place where everything is perfect, and because there is no such place as that, that's why they labeled it a utopia. But a dystopia is where everything has gone badly, and it is the most famous probably novel that I've called a dystopia is George Orwell's 1984. And also Jonathan Swift's book, Gulliver's Travels, is often referred to as a dystopia. But really, Margaret Atwood is, before this series, you may have heard of her novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which has now been made into a pretty popular TV series on Hulu. But that was her first big dystopia. And between that novel and the accomplishment of the trilogy, all of the 3 in the trilogy have now appeared. She has become perhaps the most renowned writers of dystopias. So what are some of the things we find in a dystopia? Well, it's always something that's set in the future. It has a prophetic purpose to warn human beings about the dangers of whatever it is the author is trying to warn against, and it typically it involves science and technology, and in a way, dystopic writers, one of the things that they are writing about is the dangers of technology and the limits of what human beings can actually achieve, and the dangers if we go too far. Another feature of this book that we should be aware of, it has a double time setting, not that different from Vonnegut. I mean, Billy Pilgrim goes back and forth in different times of his life, but here we have a double time frame as well. The play of one setting against the other. When we first open the novel, we meet Snowman, whose story is being told after the destruction of human beings, and he is there as a leader of sorts of the children of Crake. And so the chapters go back and forth pretty willy-nilly from that time setting to the flashbacks of the story of Jimmy. Okay, so we'll talk about Snowman versus Jimmy in a little while yet. But yeah, double time frame. So in a way, information is withheld, so to keep us in suspense. So with this double time frame. But Atwood has really created an eerily believable situation in this novel, and some of it is not necessarily, a lot of it which was intentional, but even since the book has come out, it seems that there are things that she perhaps could not have predicted that are coming about. And so here are some of the issues that are addressed in this novel. Cloning is something that has already been done, and genetic studies, continue. it wasn't that many years ago, I used to teach the novel Frankenstein a lot, and this whole idea of creating human life was something that was, never really approachable. And then cloning comes along, and we find out, oh yeah, this kind of thing is possible. So cloning is one issue that um, is present in this novel, and um, an interesting representation of the mad genius who was able to genetically manipulate his creation. Climate change is another thing that is really apparent here. That since the novel came out, I think more people are becoming increasingly aware of the implications of climate change. Um, Food is an issue. The genetic manipulation of food, making synthetic food or things from soy that in this novel it seems that meat has become a very scarce thing. And so the way that the food industry works is another thing that's, I think, a very current affair. Um, the pharmaceutical industry, people have become more suspicious of the intentions, the motivations of the pharmaceutical industry, and those that reap profit from it. And so some of those things will be talked about later on in the novel. And with that, there's also the sense of just the sheer sense of human greed, what people are capable of doing for power or profit or knowledge, is something that drives humanity. Um, so all of these things um, are, are very intricately woven into. I mean, it's just one of the things that is so impressive about this novel is all of these things being so intricately woven into the story. And one other thing in opening here, I would just say that because of the double time setting and the going back and forth in time with the flashbacks, etc., this narrative is not so much driven by plot as I don't know, I call it like the struggle to get back to the truth of the past. Snowman slash Jimmy is trying to figure out not just what happened, but why Crake brought all this thing about. So, so it's the narrative, again, not so much driven by plot, but the struggle to get back to the truth. So this opening video, this first video, is going to be kind of talking about more introductory things. And one of the things I really want to focus on here is establishing characters and also relationships between several of the characters. So Snowman and Jimmy, of course, are the same person, but I like to treat them separately as characters in a way because, Jimmy's life changes, fundamentally after the catastrophe in which, all the rest of the people died. Just think about the situation that he's in. It's desperate in a radical way. The environment is hostile toward the continuation of life. He has a very fundamental struggle to continue. The climate has become really dangerous. There are issues of the past being completely wiped away, and then scant hope for a future. He doesn't know if any other human beings, survived the catastrophe. So he is in a very precarious situation. Another thing, and I mentioned how Jimmy, in becoming Snowman, his life has changed and his character has changed. I'm always impressed in his ingenuity in maintaining his survival. I mean, all the things he has to think about with how to get water, how to get food, the tree platform to avoid being attacked by animals or things like that. how tired he must be just thinking about how to keep it all going, trying to figure out what happened. So then with Jimmy, he is in many ways a classic anti-hero. And when we talk about plot and character, the protagonist is usually someone who has superior qualities. But in the 20th century and beyond, we have the introduction of things like anti-heroes who are not necessarily villains or totally worthless people, but they're flawed characters, and that's a good word to discuss to describe Jimmy. He's flawed. He's got a certain intelligence, and he at the end, after he becomes so man, he really has the intention of trying to do the right thing. But before all that happened, he's kind of a middle of the road guy without a backbone. He blames Crake for the catastrophe, but he feels somehow implicated himself. I mentioned he is intelligent enough, but he's nothing like Crake, who is an incredible genius. At least as we learn more about him, we could call Jimmy a foil to Crake. That word foil is another literary term where the contrast between the two characters makes the strengths of one and the weaknesses of the other even more apparent. So Jimmy is a real contrast to Crake, who does not respond emotionally to things, whereas Jimmy does. But anyway, Jimmy has a great need for attention, whereas Crake kind of keeps to himself. Jimmy has a very casual attitude towards sex. He likes it, he pursues it, whereas Crake doesn't seem to have any interest in it. So the two characters are very different. Once the narrative takes us back to the beginning, to Jimmy's childhood and development, we are presented with very contrasting contrasting relationships with his parents. His father is not that difficult to summarize. He is a successful scientist at Oregon Inc. And just before we go on, I just want to mention that Margaret Atwood comes up with some really killer names of products and companies. It's very kind of witty in a very black comedy type of way. But so his father is successful, and he kind of goes along with what the powers that be want. He buys the argument that it's creating a better world, at least initially he does. And so he's willing to pretty much sell himself out. The relationship with his mother is much more difficult and more complicated to talk about. I mean, much more interesting in a way. We're not given all the information that we need, but what has she been doing? We do learn that she used to work for the same company, but she does not anymore. The claim is that she stopped working because she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom with Jimmy when he started school, but it becomes pretty clear that's not really the reason. She seems to be clinically depressed or oppressed by something. And there's also, the constant smoking. When you think of someone who is concerned with well-being of the planet or society and with health, why would she be smoking? So there seem to be some real contradictions. And then there's the issue of her disappearance. And when she does disappear, she takes Jimmy's pet raccoon killer with her. How can she do that to him? So usually, when we're in the classroom, I usually try to get students to talk about, how do you feel about this character and what are we to make of her? Because we only very gradually find out more about her. But I think more importantly, we also should ask the question of how Jimmy feels about her. If you remember at the beginning of the semester, we started with Freud, and so I don't know how much background you have with this, but if we put our Freudian thinking caps on, we can talk about Jimmy as being someone who has arrested development, which leads to problems in relating to women. He has not resolved issues and feelings that he has for his mother. He seems to want to get her attention, to get her approval, which she rarely gives him, and then she disappears. And as a result, when Jimmy starts going to school and he starts acting out, um, doing finger puppet things with his parents' arguments. These are things that kind of tell us something about Jimmy. He has this need for attention that manifests itself in theatrics, and we could also see his casual attitude towards sex with girls and other women as he grows older, as being another sort of psychological development that seems to suggest arrested development or unresolved issues. Okay, well, you see how I have this set up, that I have these character dynamics set up in the way of a triangle, and I think it makes sense. I mean, with Jimmy and his parents, it's a little bit different, but Jimmy and Crake and Oryx do make up something of, I wouldn't call it a love triangle, but eventually there is this kind of dynamic. At least Jimmy thinks so. I guess one of the things I've been saying already is that Crake does not seem to be motivated by sex or relationships in any way. So I think Jimmy's jealousy regarding Oryx and Crake is perhaps a little bit imaginary. But let's talk about the characters individually here. When we've already talked about Jimmy, Crake, I think is interesting in that he does not fit the typical mad scientist mold of the Frankenstein mythology. If you know that story in any of its forms, whether it's the Mary Shelley novel with Victor Frankenstein, or the old Boris Karloff film, or also there's a great old movie called Metropolis that has another kind of bringing inanimate objects to life, and it's always a creator driven by a wild passion for bringing the creature to life. Crake, on the other hand, is very aloof. He's calm, cool, and collected. So he does not have that same kind of almost like a romantic hero type of passion. But why does he pursue the creation of life? One answer to that is because he can. His ability creates the desire to play God. And for him, God has been discarded already. And his creation, the Crakers, as we've been calling them, are a far cry from the patching together of pieces of human flesh like we have in the Frankenstein story. It's all very high technology here. About Oryx, since she's really hardly mentioned at all and early on in the novel, she's mentioned a couple times, but it's not until like page 90 that we get more than a quick mention. The relationship between her and Jimmy and her and Crake, I think I'm going to hold off a little bit because it's a little bit more complicated here with her. I want to step back and talk about something else first. Another relationship that I wanted to spend a little time with concerns not so much Jimmy and his mother and Jimmy and Crake, but there seems to be a connection of sorts between Crake and Jimmy's mother. Um, it is mentioned that it was in the same month. Crake comes to Jimmy's school, Healthwiser, right before Jimmy's mother disappears. And then it is also mentioned that Jimmy's mother, who is, irritable all the time and depressed and smoking all the time, she has taken a liking to Crake. She thinks that he's mature, responsibly. He's more of an adult than even some of the adults. And so why this interest in him? And then at the same time, right after, Crake comes is the time when Jimmy's mother leaves. There are some other interesting developments a little bit later on when Jimmy and Craig are watching news reports, and all of a sudden Jimmy's mother appears. Craig is able to freeze this, download this, and to keep it, to conceal from Craig's Uncle Pete what was going on the screen. Just seems to create something of a mysterious connection between Craig and Jimmy's mother, and also possibly in the suggestion of another link between Craig and Jimmy, how Craig has come into Jimmy's life, and eventually how he gets Jimmy to basically do whatever he wants him to pull off his plan in the end. In addition to the very mysterious connection between Craig and Jimmy's mother, there is a mysterious connection in this triangle. So we're coming back to the triangle between Jimmy and Craig and Oryx again. And in particular, I want to focus on Oryx here because Jimmy becomes completely obsessed with her. And the first time that he sees her is on a video, and it's a pornographic video. And she's only 8 or 9 years old, but there's something about the passage. There's something about that scene in the video that completely captures Jimmy's attention in a way that is, what happens here? Craig is going to notice Jimmy's reaction to this video, to this girl who's looking right at the camera. And he downloads it. He freezes the frame, downloads it, and even prints out a copy and gives it to Jimmy, which is something that they tend to do once in a while. If they see something on videos, they would download them and keep them. But Craig here notices something happening with Jimmy that has to do with Oryx. And it's a very significant moment. I'm just going to read you a bit of this scene from page 90 and 91. Let's see. So the top of page 90, it says, "This is how the two of them first saw Oryx. She was only about 8, or she looked 8. They could never find out for certain how old she'd been. Her name wasn't Oryx. She didn't have a name. She was just another little girl on a porno site." But then at the bottom of 90, it says, "Oryx paused in her activities. She smiled a hard little smile that made her appear much older and wiped the whipped cream from her mouth. Then she looked over her shoulder and right into the eyes of the viewer, right into Jimmy's eyes, into the secret person inside him. 'I see you,' that look said. 'I see you watching. I know you. I know what you want.'" Craig pushed the reverse, then the freeze, then the download. Every so often he froze frames. By now he had a small archive of them. Sometimes he'd print them out and give a copy to Jimmy. It could be dangerous. It could leave a footprint for anyone who might manage to trace a way through the labyrinth, but Crake did it anyway. Jimmy felt burned by this look, eaten into as if by acid. All right, and I'll just end there. I mean, you can read the rest on your own, but it's just like he's frozen with this look that she gives. And shortly after this, we get to hear the story of Oryx's life as a child, as being sold into slavery by her parents, and how she grows up. Later, however, Crake enlists Oryx to work with him on the Paradise Project, and the way it is set up, it looks as if Crake and Oryx are having an affair, that they're partners of some kind. Jimmy thinks that they're in love or something. And to the viewer, though, or the reader, I don't think that we really get a sense. We have never thought that Crake had any kind of emotional or romantic interest in anyone. And what seems to be implied is that Crake kind of knows about this obsession that Jimmy has with Oryx. And it seems to be implied, too, that almost from the get-go, from the time even before they first see Oryx on that screen, Crake might be planning on using Jimmy as well for his project. And he uses Oryx. He keeps Oryx in sight and around Jimmy so that Jimmy stays interested. I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, over the course of the novel, we see that Jimmy doesn't always see things accurately. And he doesn't necessarily see that he's being used by Crake. Well, I mean, he does eventually at the end, but for a long time, he does not suspect that he's being used by Crake. Right, the last introductory comment I wanted to make is just to run through some of the details that Crake has designed for his creation. He's making these new creations. I mean, the motives is something that we have to talk about a little bit later, but he's trying to create better creatures. He kind of has seen what human beings have done with the earth, with the environment, and sees that it's a failed experiment. And he's trying to improve on that. And so when he creates these new creatures, he builds into them things that are, and his improvements, I guess is the word we're looking at. So they have this purring activity, and these are page numbers that are following him. I'm following the terms here so that you can go and see exactly a description of what is going on here. But this purring activity is to heal wounds, to make things better, which is kind of magical. But it's something that apparently cats can do. They also have a ritual of urinating an area for protection from other kinds of animals. So this is a characteristic trait that lots of animals in the world have. They mark their space by urinating, and so this is an activity that the Quakers use. They have a very elaborate sexual ritual, which you can read for yourself on page 164 and 5. And the turning blue of the penises and the use of several males for that activity seems really quite bizarre, but Crake's design is very intentional with that. Their diet is very unusual. They're vegetarians, and so you can read more about that. And then very early in the book, when Snowman is first describing the Quakers who have come to visit him, he talks about their skin. It's protected. They have natural protection from ultraviolet rays, Whereas, you know, with Snowman, he has to put all kinds of stuff over his skin because the climate now is very dangerous, and there's a, in addition to the daily afternoon rainstorms, the sun is incredibly dangerous. So Crake had foreseen all this as something to protect his creatures from. Okay, so once again, this first video is intended to really just to get you started with a number of the characters, the relationships that are introduced early on in the book. Next time, I'll be expecting that you will have read through the book. We'll be talking about some of the more important questions about what Crake's motives really were in both eliminating the human, or trying to eliminate the human race, introduce the Crakers into the world as replacements. Who were some of the people that he used? I mean, in addition to Jimmy, in addition to Oryx, I mean, Oryx winds up being someone who was also used by Crake. And then there were other people who helped him on the project that were used. So his motivation, who he used, and what exactly the details were. So more of that will come in the next video.